One of the most prominent Republican lawmakers passed away last night at the age of 71. Initial findings show Graham died from an aorta rupture connected to hardening of the arteries.
For a man who spent 3 decades shaping American foreign policy, who stood beside presidents and walked through active war zones, Lindsey Graham went home at night to a 2-bedroom brick townhouse that most tourists would walk right past without a second glance. That is the part of this story almost nobody talks about. Not the politics, not the headlines, not the arguments on cable news, but the quiet, almost startling smallness of the places this powerful man actually called home. And on the night his life ended, inside one of those very ordinary houses, the story of where he lived became inseparable from the story of how he died. Lindsey Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in the small mill town of Central, South Carolina. His first home was not really a house at all. His parents, Florence James Graham and Millie Graham, ran a combination restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store called the Sanitary Cafe, and for a stretch of his childhood the whole family lived in a single room tucked behind that business. One room held the beds, the kitchen table, and whatever furniture they could fit. There was no separate space for a child to retreat to, no bedroom door to shut against the noise of the bar on the other side of the wall. By the time he was a young boy, Graham was already racking pool balls for customers and helping keep the place running. It was an upbringing built entirely around work, around adults, and around a business that never really closed. That early home life is worth sitting with, because everything that came after it, the modest houses, the bachelor lifestyle, the total devotion to his job, seems to trace back to those cramped rooms above and behind his parents' bar. He was, by his own account, an average student. He did not shine in the classroom, but something in him wanted more than the mill town could offer, and as a teenager he told classmates he intended to be governor of South Carolina one day. It was the kind of statement that gets a kid laughed at, and it reportedly did. He became the first person in his family to attend college, and he kept moving forward, even as the ground underneath him was about to give way completely. While he was still an undergraduate, his mother Millie was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she died in her early 50s. About 15 months later, while Graham was a first-year law student, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. In the space of little more than a year, he lost both of his parents. He was in his early 20s. Waiting for him in the wreckage of that loss was his much younger sister, Darlene, who was still a young teenager. Rather than let her be raised by someone else, Graham became her legal guardian, and he later formally adopted her so she could receive certain benefits tied to his military service. He has said publicly that watching her grow into the person she became is one of the proudest things in his life. Darlene has described him not just as a brother, but as something closer to a parent, the person who held her world together when it fell apart. That decision, made by a young man barely out of his teens, effectively delayed or replaced the kind of family life most people build for themselves. Graham spent his early and mid-20s raising a teenage girl instead of building a household of his own. He never married. He never had children of his own, and by the time his guardianship of Darlene was no longer the center of his daily life, the pattern was already set. He would go on to spend his adult life taking care of other people, first his sister, then the soldiers he represented as a military lawyer, then his home state, and eventually American foreign policy on a global scale. Somewhere along that long chain of responsibility, the ordinary comforts of a family home never got built for himself. Graham's working life as an adult began in a courtroom, not a campaign office. After law school, he joined the United States Air Force as a military attorney in 1982, first defending service members and later prosecuting them. He was stationed in Europe, where for several years he served as the Air Force's chief prosecutor across the continent, and he even appeared on the television program 60 Minutes defending a pilot in a case that exposed problems in how the military tested its equipment. This was not a ceremonial role. It was a young lawyer wading into real disputes with real consequences for the people involved. He never fully left the military once he entered politics. He continued serving in the South Carolina Air National Guard and later the Air Force Reserve for years after he was first elected to Congress, all without collecting a military paycheck, since federal law does not allow sitting members of Congress to draw one. He was called to active duty during the Gulf War in the early 1990s and later did stints in Iraq and Afghanistan, working on legal issues tied to the detention of prisoners during those conflicts. For that service he received the Bronze Star. He retired from the Air Force Reserve in 2015, holding the rank of colonel, after more than 3 decades in uniform. His political rise ran on a parallel track. He won a seat in the House of Representatives in 1994, flipping a district that had not elected a Republican since the 1870s, part of a broader wave that reshaped Congress that year. In 2002, when longtime South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond retired, Graham won the seat and became the first newly elected senator his state had chosen in decades. He held that seat for more than 20 years, surviving a serious primary challenge in 2014 by building an enormous grassroots operation of staffers, volunteers, and local organizers across South Carolina. It is worth remembering that this was a man who, by his early 40s, had already survived the loss of both parents, raised a child to adulthood, served in 2 wars, and built a national political career, all before most people have settled into a single long-term home. The stability he never quite built for himself in his personal life seemed to show up instead in his choice of real estate. He did not move from house to house chasing bigger properties as his career advanced, the way many successful politicians eventually do. He picked 2 modest homes early in his adult life and stayed in both of them for the rest of it. Despite the power that came with more than 2 decades in the Senate, Graham's personal finances and living arrangements stayed remarkably modest. Property records show that in 1993 he bought a modest 3-bedroom home in Seneca, South Carolina, for $164,000, and it remained his primary residence for the rest of his life. Seneca is a small city in the northwestern corner of the state, near Lake Yowie and the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, not far from where he grew up. Friends and former staff have said that when Graham was home from Washington, that unassuming ranch-style house was where he actually wanted to be, a quiet contrast to the demands of national politics. His communications director for nearly 3 decades has said publicly that Graham's real luxuries in life amounted to little more than an American-made SUV and a set of golf clubs. His net worth by the time of his death was estimated at somewhere between $1 and $2 million, a relatively small figure for someone who had spent so long at the center of Washington power. In Washington itself, Graham's living situation was similarly unglamorous. In the mid-1990s, after he arrived in the House, he bought a half-share in a Capitol Hill townhouse with a fellow congressman, and when that colleague left Congress a few years later, Graham bought out the rest of the property. The home sits on Capitol Hill, a short distance from the dome itself, a brick row house of roughly 1,200 square feet with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. It was never a mansion. It was the kind of townhouse you would find lining any quiet residential block in that part of the city, distinguished from its neighbors only by the fact that a sitting United States senator happened to live behind its door. For nearly 3 decades, that small brick house was where Graham slept during the long stretches of the year Congress kept him in the Capitol, alone, without a spouse or children sharing the space with him. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it is easy to assume that a man this famous, this connected, this influential, must have lived somewhere grand. He did not. He lived in a starter home-sized townhouse on Capitol Hill and a modest 3-bedroom ranch house back in Seneca, the same 2 properties for decades, while the rest of his life expanded to include meetings with world leaders and trips into active war zones. The scale of his homes never grew to match the scale of his influence. In many ways, that gap says more about who Graham was than any speech he ever gave on the Senate floor. Graham's relationship with the man who would eventually become his closest political ally was not always warm. During the 2016 presidential primary, Graham was one of Trump's harshest critics inside the Republican Party, at one point publicly calling him unfit for the presidency and urging voters to reject him. Trump responded in kind, at one campaign event reading Graham's personal cell phone number aloud to a crowd of supporters, inviting them to call him directly. It was about as public and personal a feud as 2 men in the same party could have. Yet within a year of Trump taking office, the 2 men had reached an understanding, beginning with a lunch in the spring of 2017 that former staff describe as the real turning point. From there, the relationship grew into regular rounds of golf, frequent phone calls, and eventually one of the tightest working partnerships in the Senate. Graham defended Trump through impeachment proceedings, campaigned for his re-election, and became a fixture at his rallies. For a brief stretch after the events at the Capitol in early 2021, Graham publicly distanced himself, saying he was finished with the relationship, but the alliance mended and held for the remainder of Graham's life. The other defining friendship of Graham's Senate career belonged to Arizona Senator John McCain. The 2 men, along with a small circle of colleagues, traveled together to conflict zones and allied nations for more than 2 decades, forming a bond that outlasted policy disagreements and party politics. When McCain died of brain cancer in 2018, those who knew Graham well said something in him changed permanently. McCain's daughter, Meghan McCain, wrote after Graham's own death that she could barely separate her memories of her father's Senate career from her memories of Graham standing beside him, and that if her father was the steady center of their small circle, Graham was its energy and its humor. It is a detail that helps explain why, when Graham's own Senate desk was draped in black following his death, it carried extra weight that the desk had once belonged to McCain himself. Graham's foreign policy instincts, shaped in no small part by his decades in uniform, made him one of the most consistently hawkish voices in the Senate. He pushed for American involvement or support in conflicts stretching from Iraq and Afghanistan to Syria, Libya, and Ukraine, and he was one of Israel's most outspoken defenders on Capitol Hill, close enough to Israeli leadership that its prime minister publicly mourned him as one of the country's great friends in Washington. Critics accused him of chasing conflict too eagerly. Supporters saw a man who had actually worn the uniform and understood, better than most of his colleagues, what military action asked of the people who carried it out. Whichever side of that debate a person landed on, few disputed that Graham's positions were consistent across decades and never really softened with age. By the summer of 2026, Graham was in the middle of his usual frantic pace, a pace that colleagues would later describe as unsustainable for a man his age but entirely characteristic of how he had operated for years. He had just secured his party's nomination for a 5th Senate term, and in the second week of July, he traveled to Ukraine, a country he had visited many times before as one of Kiev's most vocal supporters in Congress. He met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, toured a facility producing interceptor drones, and told reporters he felt more optimistic than ever that a path to ending the war had finally come into view. That optimism, captured on camera just 1 day before his death, is part of what makes the story that followed feel so abrupt. He flew home to Washington on Saturday, July 11th. That evening, he spoke by phone with President Donald Trump, updating him on the trip. Trump later said Graham sounded tired but otherwise fine, and that the call, in hindsight, may have been one of the senator's last conversations. Not long after that call, according to an account later shared by fellow Senator Tommy Tuberville, Graham phoned a member of his staff, his scheduler, and told her he was having chest pains and needed help. She was not at his townhouse when he called. She was in Baltimore, roughly an hour away, and immediately called 911 while making her way toward Washington. Dispatch records show emergency crews were sent to Graham's Capitol Hill address around 8:30 that evening, responding to a report of chest pains that quickly escalated to cardiac arrest. When paramedics arrived, they found the front door locked, and radio traffic captured them requesting help getting inside. First responders forced entry into the home, and by the time Graham's scheduler reached the townhouse herself, crews were already performing CPR. A neighbor later described seeing an older man carried out on a stretcher and loaded into an ambulance around 9:30 p.m., before he was taken to George Washington University Hospital. Despite the efforts of the paramedics and hospital staff, Graham did not survive. His office announced his death shortly after 2 o'clock the following morning, saying only that Senator Graham had passed away from a brief and sudden illness, and asking for prayers and privacy for his family. A day later, the District of Columbia Medical Examiner's Office released a preliminary finding. The cause of death was an aortic dissection, a tear in the body's main artery, brought on by underlying cardiovascular disease. Tommy Tuberville, reflecting on his colleague's final hours, put it in blunt terms that stuck with a lot of people who heard them. He said Graham had essentially worked himself to death, that most senators have families to go home to, but Graham did not, and that any time Congress gave him a few days off, he would be at the airport heading somewhere else to try to solve a problem for the country. It is hard to hear that account without connecting it back to the earliest chapters of his life. The boy raised in a single room behind a bar, the young man who gave up his own 20s to raise his sister instead of starting a family of his own. He spent a lifetime taking care of everyone except himself, and in the end there was no spouse in the house that night, no children down the hall, only a locked door between him and the people trying to reach him in time.